The Hunter household was the picture of a quiet suburban life. Tucked at the end of a tree-lined street, it was the sort of place where the days blurred into each other, governed by the predictable rhythm of daily routine. Mr. Hunter, a man of modest pleasures, shared a peaceful existence with his wife Anna. Though content, there lingered an unspoken sense of anticipation in their lives, as if they were waiting for something to break the tranquility. That something arrived one late afternoon in the form of an unexpected visitor. Captain Terrance, an old friend and a man seasoned by 15 years of service in the Middle East, appeared on their doorstep. Mr. Hunter greeted him warmly, but couldn't ignore the changes in his friend. Terrance's posture, once proud and confident, now seemed burdened. His face, etched with deep lines, hinted at unspeakable experiences. The evening unfolded with hearty laughter and the clink of beer bottles. Hours passed as the friends reminisced about their youth. The air was filled with a comfortable ease, but as Terrance shifted in his chair, something tumbled from his pocket, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Mr. Hunter leaned down, curious. His fingers brushed against the fallen object, and as he lifted it to eye level, a shiver raced up his spine. It was a small, grotesque thing, withered and knotted like a twisted root. "What's this?" Mr. Hunter asked, intrigued. Terrance's expression darkened. "That is no ordinary trinket," he replied, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I got it in Kabul, from a man who looked like he'd witnessed too many horrors. He told me it's a relic meant to remind people that fate controls our lives, and those who try to alter it pay a terrible price." Mr. Hunter examined the object more closely, its gnarled form unsettling. "What do you mean by price?" Terrance hesitated, his voice hollow when he spoke again. "I've made my wishes, and I've paid dearly for them. This thing twists your desires into something dark. No matter how innocent your wish seems, it'll find a way to make you regret it. Trust me, you don't want this." Despite the ominous warning, Mr. Hunter couldn't help but feel drawn to the strange relic. He glanced at Anna, whose eyes were fixed on the shriveled thing, a mixture of revulsion and fascination in her gaze. Without warning, Terrance stood and walked to the back patio, where the barbecue sat cold and unused. He opened the grill, tossed the paw onto the coals, and watched as flames licked at it. "What are you doing?" Mr. Hunter exclaimed, rushing to the grill. Grabbing a pair of tongues, he fished the paw from the fire before it could be consumed by the flames. Terrance sighed deeply. "You shouldn't have done that." Hunter chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Terrance. You don't really believe in all this, do you? It's just superstition. If it's so powerful, why not wish for something ridiculous, like wings?" He raised the paw with mock grandeur. "I wish I had wings." Anna giggled at her husband's antics, but Terrance's face drained of color. His voice sharpened as he stepped forward. "Don't joke about this, you have no idea what you're dealing with." The laughter died instantly, as Terrance's grave expression sliced through the moment. His eyes, now filled with a haunted intensity, held theirs. "If you ever make a real wish, hold it in your right hand, cover it with your left, and speak your desire aloud. But for the love of God, don't use it. Get rid of it." Though still skeptical, Mr. Hunter sensed the weight of his friend's words. He wondered if Terrance had been broken by the horrors of war, scarred in ways that made him believe in such things. He nodded, though inwardly dismissing the whole affair as the product of a troubled mind. The rest of the night passed in strained silence, and Sergeant Terrance retired early to the guest room, saying little after the incident with the paw. The next morning, he packed his bag and prepared to leave. Mr. Hunter saw him off at the door, their embrace tight but somber. "I've got to report back to base," Terrance said, his voice soft, almost lost in the morning breeze. "Another mission." Mr. Hunter clapped his friend on the back, forcing a smile. "Stay safe out there, brother." As Terrance walked to his car, he paused briefly, glancing back with an expression of deep sorrow. "Just be careful," he whispered, before driving away, leaving the hunters standing in their doorway, a strange unease settling over them. Days passed since Captain Terrance's departure, and life in the Hunter household returned to its usual routine. The monkey's paw, now buried under old receipts and forgotten trinkets in a drawer, seemed little more than an odd keepsake. Mr. Hunter hadn't thought much of it, or so he told himself. Yet, in quiet moments, Captain Terrance's grim warning echoed faintly in his mind, tugging at the edges of his thoughts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the living room in hues of amber, the hunters found themselves locked in conversation about finances. The numbers weren't adding up, bills were mounting, and the weight of the looming mortgage pressed heavily on Mr. Hunter's shoulders. "Maybe we should sell the car," Anna suggested, her voice heavy with concern. "We're struggling to keep up with the payments." Mr. Hunter nodded, though the idea twisted his gut. The car was one of the few luxuries they had left. The thought of giving it up filled him with a deep frustration. His eyes wandered toward the drawer where the paw lay hidden, thoughts he couldn't quite dismiss beginning to form. "I'll figure something out," he muttered, more to himself than to Anna. That night, long after Anna had gone to bed, Mr. Hunter found himself alone in the dimly lit living room. His gaze drifted again to the drawer. Slowly, almost without realizing, he rose from the couch, walked over, and pulled the drawer open. There it was, the monkey's paw. Its shriveled form seemed harmless, almost comical in the faint light, but the memory of its unsettling touch and Captain Terrance's words lingered. What harm could it do? He thought, brushing off the unease. Terrance had likely been exaggerating, his mind twisted by years of hardship. And yet, Mr. Hunter hesitated before finally picking up the paw. It felt dry, almost brittle, as if it might crumble in his hand. With a deep breath, he sat back on the couch, holding the relic in his right hand, his left hovering above it as instructed. The absurdity of it all made him chuckle quietly, but the pressure of his financial troubles loomed large. "I wish for enough money to pay off the mortgage," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, as if time itself had paused. Mr. Hunter sighed, a mixture of relief and embarrassment washing over him. But just as he was about to dismiss the whole thing, he felt it. The paw twitched. It was a subtle movement, just a slight contraction of the withered fingers, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through him. His heart raced as he recoiled, dropping the paw onto the floor. For several long moments, he simply stared at it, breath shallow and hands trembling. The relic now lay motionless, its grotesque form lifeless once more. It took him some time to gather his courage, and when he finally did, he gingerly picked up the paw and stuffed it back into the drawer, slamming it shut with trembling hands. He hurried to bed, but sleep eluded him for most of the night, his mind replaying the moment when the paw had moved. The next morning dawned like any other. Mr. Hunter rose early, prepared breakfast, and sifted through the usual pile of bills. It wasn't until his phone rang that the strange events of the night before resurfaced. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Mr. Hunter?" A calm, detached voice on the other end asked. "This is Officer Delaney from the police department. I'm afraid there's been an accident." Mr. Hunter's heart skipped a beat. His grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" he stammered, dread building in his chest. "It's your wife, sir. There was a car accident. We need you to come to the city morgue for identification." His world shattered in an instant. He hung up without saying another word, his hands shaking as he stumbled toward the door, barely aware of the drive to the morgue. The streets blurred, and the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears drowned out everything else. When he arrived, the cold sterility of the morgue struck him, amplifying the emptiness inside. An officer guided him to a small, dimly lit room where a sheet-covered body lay on a steel table. Mr. Hunter barely registered the attendant's presence as the sheet was drawn back. What remained of Anna was almost unrecognizable. Her once familiar face was now a mass of bruises and lacerations. Her body, mangled beyond recognition, told the horrific tale of a car accident that had left little but wreckage behind. Mr. Hunter stood in numbed silence, his mind screaming for this to be a nightmare from which he would soon wake. He nodded mechanically when asked to confirm her identity, though no words left his lips. The drive home felt like a journey through a fog. His thoughts spiraled in every direction, replaying the last moments with Anna over and over as if searching for some way to reverse what had happened. But the cold reality remained. A few days later, the funeral came and went, a painful blur of sorrow and hollow condolences. Captain Terrance attended, though the two men exchanged no words, only a brief embrace that conveyed all the grief and regret that needed to be said. When Mr. Hunter returned home, still cloaked in the numbness of his loss, a letter awaited him. The envelope bore the logo of the insurance company. His hands shook as he opened it, the contents a cruel reminder of the wish he had made. The life insurance payout would cover exactly the amount needed to settle the mortgage. Mr. Hunter dropped the letter, his body trembling as realization struck. The paw had granted his wish, but at a cost he could never have imagined. Weeks passed, but the grief in the Hunter household only deepened. The once warm and inviting home had become a hollow, oppressive space, echoing with the absence of Anna. Every room held a reminder of her, each memory a dagger twisting in Mr. Hunter's heart. The life insurance money sat untouched in his bank account, a constant, mocking reminder of the cruel price he had paid for his wish. The sorrow weighed heavily on him, turning the house into a prison. Mr. Hunter withdrew from everything, work, friends, and the world outside. Most nights he wandered through the darkened halls of his home, consumed by regret and guilt, his mind replaying every decision that had led to his current misery. But always, his thoughts drifted back to the drawer where the monkey's paw remained hidden. At first, he resisted the pull. He knew the danger, knew how the paw twisted desires into horrors, but the thought gnawed at him. What if he could undo it? What if he could bring Anna back? One evening, the silence of the house became unbearable. The weight of his grief crushed him, suffocating all rational thought. He could no longer resist. His hands trembling, Mr. Hunter approached the drawer, opening it with the same caution he'd had before. There it was, the grotesque relic, waiting in the shadows. This time, as his fingers closed around it, the familiar chill coursed through him. Sitting at the dining table, his heart raced with the knowledge of what he was about to do. The warnings, the tragedy, none of it seemed to matter in the face of his overwhelming sorrow. He held the paw in his right hand, his left covering it as Captain Terrance had instructed. The weight of the decision bore down on him. "I wish for Anna to come back," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. For a long moment the house remained still. The air felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Mr. Hunter stared at the paw, the silence pressing in around him. Nothing happened. He sighed, the tension in his chest slowly releasing. Perhaps the paw's power had run its course. Perhaps it couldn't grant the same wish twice. He stood from the table, his body heavy with exhaustion and the weight of unfulfilled hope. The night dragged on, and eventually, Mr. Hunter retreated to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced, replaying the moment of the wish, the fear that something might happen, and the strange relief when nothing did. Finally, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, it came. A knock, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Mr. Hunter's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen. There it was again, another soft knock at the door. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, fear, hope, disbelief. It couldn't be, could it? The knock came again, louder this time. Mr. Hunter threw the covers aside and stumbled out of bed. His pulse quickened as he made his way toward the front door. Each step felt like a lifetime, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. By the time he reached the door, the knocking had grown more insistent. With a trembling hand, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, but the chill that gripped him was far deeper. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the faint light of the moon, was Anna. But this was not the Anna he had lost. Her body, once graceful, was now broken and disfigured. Her clothes were torn, stained with dirt and dried blood. Her face, what remained of it, was a grotesque mask of pallid skin, bruised and lifeless. Her eyes, once full of warmth, were now clouded and empty. Mr. Hunter stood frozen in place, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. This was not his Anna. This was something else, something wrong. His wish had brought her back, but it had twisted her, just as Captain Terrance had warned. "Anna," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure that had once been his wife took a slow, unsteady step forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Her arms raised, fingers reaching out for him in a silent plea. Mr. Hunter's heart pounded in his chest, the sickening realization of what he had done settling in. He had brought her back, but this was not the woman he had loved. This was a mockery, a nightmare born from his wish. In a blind panic, he slammed the door shut, stumbling backward as his breath came in frantic gasps. He could hear her on the other side, the soft scraping of her fingers against the wood, the faint shuffle of her feet as she stood there, waiting. Then the knocking began again. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't a knock asking for entry, it was demanding it. Mr. Hunter backed away, his mind racing. He had to do something, anything, to stop this. His feet carried him to the bedroom, where he locked the door behind him, collapsing against it as his chest heaved with fear. But the knocking continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if she was getting closer to breaking through. His hand fumbled in his pocket, closing around the monkey's paw. One more wish, just one more. Mr. Hunter sat pressed against the bedroom door, his entire body trembling with fear. The relentless pounding continued, each violent thud reverberating through the house, shaking the wooden frame and sending shivers down his spine. The sound was no longer just noise. It was a stark reminder of the unspeakable horror that waited just beyond the door. "Anna," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the terrible truth. She had returned, but not as she was. What stood outside was something far worse, something twisted by his own doing. The pounding grew more frantic, more desperate. What had started as knocks had transformed into a violent assault on the door. She wasn't just asking to come in anymore, she was demanding entry. The frame began to buckle under the force of her blows, the wood splintering, each crack bringing her closer to him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he clutched the monkey's paw tighter. The grotesque shape of the relic dug into his palm, its dry surface biting against his skin. Fear coursed through him. He had one wish left, one chance to stop this madness, but he hesitated. The paw had already twisted his desires, turning his hopes into nightmares. What if this final wish only made things worse? Another deafening crash shattered his thoughts. The door frame buckled completely, the wood splintering as the door itself gave way. Shadows twisted in the dim light of the room, and Mr. Hunter scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he backed away. She was there, in the doorway. Anna, or what was left of her, stood before him, illuminated by the faint light from the hall. Her form was even more grotesque up close. Her once living body now a disfigured horror. Her skin hung loosely from her face, pale and marred with deep bruises. Her limbs were twisted at impossible angles, moving in unnatural jerks as she stepped into the room. Her mouth opened and closed in silent gasps, her lifeless eyes fixed on him with a vacant, haunting stare. Mr. Hunter's body shook with terror, his back pressing against the far wall as she inched closer. His mind screamed for an escape, but there was none. This was no longer his wife. This was something broken, something wrong. "Anna?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with a desperate, futile hope. She took another step forward, her arms lifting, fingers outstretched toward him. Her movements were slow and jerky, as if her very being was fighting against itself to reach him. Each step sent fresh waves of panic crashing over Mr. Hunter, his heart racing faster with every second. He had asked for her to return, but this was not the woman he had loved. This was a distorted reflection, a cruel mockery of his wish gone horribly wrong. In blind panic, Mr. Hunter fumbled for the paw, gripping it with both hands. The relic felt heavier now, its twisted fingers cold against his skin. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning in frantic circles as he tried to form a coherent wish. What could he ask for that wouldn't turn against him? What could he say to stop this nightmare? She was only inches away now, her grotesque hand nearly brushing his arm. He could feel the cold air that clung to her, the scent of earth and decay filling his lungs as he recoiled from her touch. "I wish she was gone," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air in the room grew still, an unnatural silence falling over everything. Hunter's pulse thundered in his ears as he clutched the paw, its fingers curling inward, tightening with a finality that sent a chill through him. And then, there was nothing. He opened his eyes slowly, unsure of when he had closed them. The room was quiet. Anna? No, the creature that had been Anna was gone. The door hung limply from its hinges, the hallway beyond empty and still. The air, which had moments before been thick with dread, now felt eerily calm. Mr. Hunter collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. It was over. The nightmare had ended. He had made the final wish, and she was gone, sent back to whatever horrible place she had come from. Tears streamed down his face as the weight of what had happened settled over him. He had wished her away, again. She had returned, twisted and broken, but she had returned. And now, in his fear, he had sent her away once more. This time, there would be no bringing her back. The house, once a place of safety and love, now felt like an empty tomb. The silence was deafening, the absence of her presence overwhelming. He sat there in the darkened room, alone with the knowledge of what he had done. The monkey's paw lay on the floor beside him, its magic spent. It had granted him his wish, but at a price he could never have imagined. Months passed, and the house where the Hunters had lived was eventually put up for sale. Life in the quiet neighborhood returned to its normal pace, with most of the residents barely remembering the tragedy that had unfolded behind the closed doors of that now empty home. The whispers faded, the memories dulled, and soon the house was just another piece of real estate, waiting for new occupants. It didn't take long for the house to find new owners, a young couple eager to begin the next chapter of their lives together. To them, it was perfect. Spacious, filled with light, and nestled in a peaceful community, the house seemed to be everything they had been searching for. They settled in quickly, filling the space with laughter and the excitement of a future yet unwritten. The first few weeks passed in a blur of activity. They unpacked boxes, decorated rooms, and made the house their own. The energy of their new beginning filled every corner, replacing the stagnant air of the past with fresh hopes and dreams. They laughed over shared meals, planned renovations, and spoke of the family they hoped to one day raise within those walls. One afternoon, while her husband was at work, the wife decided to tackle the clutter in the basement. It was a space that had remained largely untouched since they moved in, filled with dusty old boxes left behind by previous owners, relics of lives long forgotten. She sorted through the mess, discarding items that meant nothing to her and organizing those she could repurpose. That's when she found it. Hidden beneath a pile of rags in the farthest corner of the basement was a small, unmarked wooden box. It was old and weathered, its surface rough and splintered, out of place among the other abandoned items. Curious, she brushed off the dust and opened the lid. Inside, there was a small, brittle diary, its pages yellowed with age. Next to it, wrapped carefully in a faded cloth, was something else. Her fingers moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as she unwrapped the cloth to reveal the object hidden within. A monkey's paw. She frowned, picking it up, its grotesque, withered form immediately unsettling. The diary sat beside it, fragile and delicate, but something about the paw drew her attention more. She turned it over in her hands, trying to make sense of its bizarre appearance, the twisted shape and dry texture unnerving. After a long moment, she set it aside and opened the diary. The pages were filled with shaky, uneven handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The story within was strange, impossible even. But as she read, the details of what had happened in the house before them began to unfold. Her brow furrowed deeper as the words pulled her in, describing a tragic tale of wishes, loss, and an ancient relic that had brought nothing but pain. The more she read, the more captivated she became, her mind wrestling with the impossible nature of the story. But something about it felt real. Too real. She glanced over at the monkey's paw, its grotesque form lying still on the dusty floor, and then she paused. What if,